After Hillary Clinton's win in the South Carolina primary, she now has 91 pledged delegates. Pledged or elected delegates are those won in primary and caucus contests. Senator Bernie Sanders has 65. It takes a total of 2,383 delegates to win the Democratic nomination. Also counted toward that total are so-called superdelegates. There are 712 of them, and they can support whichever candidate they prefer. These are Democratic leaders like governors, members of Congress, and party officials who each get a vote in selecting the nominee. The Republican Party has the equivalent of superdelegates, but they comprise 7% of its total delegates compared to 15% for Democrats. At last count, 453 Democratic superdelegates have publicly pledged their plans to support Mrs. Clinton. Just 20 are siding with Mr. Sanders. Some Sanders supporters are crying foul, saying it's unfair that establishment superdelegates are given the opportunity to potentially override the will of the voters, that in their eyes, it's not very democratic that the Democratic Party has rules like this. What's the Sanders campaign saying about this? Not much, at least for the moment. For starters, they knew the ground rules coming in. Superdelegates are a well-established part of the Democrats' primary process. A top advisor to Mr. Sanders, Tad Devine, says the superdelegate system weighs the scales toward an establishment candidate, but he tells me it's just something we have to deal with. Back in 2008, Mr. Devine told a video blogger that superdelegates who can swap allegiances at any time act as a backstop.
Sometimes in a nominating process, you can have a nominee, for example, who did very well early on, who became the putative nominee of the party, and then suddenly a huge scandal evokes.
If that were to happen, Mr. Devine says, superdelegates could swoop in and save the day by turning against the scandalized candidate, preventing him or her from getting a majority of delegates. Is that the only way to stop a scandalized candidate? No. As Brookings' Elaine Kmark, author of the book Primary Politics, says, elected delegates have wiggle room too. They're bound in all good conscience to vote for the candidate they were elected to represent, but could, under extraordinary circumstances, do otherwise. Could superdelegates overturn the will of the people? Ms. Kmark says yes, in theory, though it hasn't happened in the last 2.5 decades of today's superdelegate system. That's why Ms. Kmark says then-Senator Barack Obama's campaign in 2008 aimed to finish the primary season with at least a 100 elected delegate margin over Mrs. Clinton as a security policy against superdelegates throwing their support behind her. In this an anything is possible election year, Mr. Devine, who again is now working for Team Sanders, says the senator's campaign wouldn't focus on the issue of Clinton-leaning superdelegates until we get to the point in time that it should be the topic. That's today's campaign calculus.